I'd like to take a few moments and read some general remarks from George Van Eps's Harmonic Mechanisms for the Guitar, Volume 3. It's the red book. Has some very interesting things, particularly in the back, but I'm just interested in these ideas that he puts out for the student to bear in mind. I think they're important. George initially wanted to call these books Harmonic Mechanisms for the Guitar and Mind, but the publisher Mel Bay didn't like the and mind part and took it away. And I know from conversations with George that he was upset about this and really wanted that connection to be shown to be needed and necessary. So here are some general remarks from Volume 3 of Harmonic Mechanisms for the Guitar. A teacher must not impose or force musical preferences or styles on the student. A conscientious teacher must strive to fan the student's spark of individuality and inventiveness into a raging fire. An instrument in good condition is not unlike a computer in this sense. The output cannot be any better than the input. The closest, most intimate relationship we will ever enjoy is the relationship between ourselves and our instrument, because this is when the two entities must become one. I have been told, and of course I realize, that my grammar at times is a bit unusual, but after all, the subject is not grammar. I'm also known to be quite redundant at times, most of the time as a matter of fact, but I've found over the years things must be pictured and explained many different ways in the hope that one of them will find an open door into the mind. There are certain aspects of each concept that are related and linked together, as will be noted when studied, but the basic principles of each are different and individual. Become familiar with the subtle differences in them. The left hand must become capable of judging distances and attitudes very accurately. The fingers, after the hand has delivered them to where they are to function, must be able to judge distances in all directions simultaneously. They must judge long, awkward spreads of all kinds down to distances of just a few thousandths of an inch. Here's an example. The average business card is about 7 thousandths of an inch thick. When an inner voice is moving on the second, third, fourth, fifth strings while the adjoining strings are sounding, the fingers only have half the thickness of that card to play with. In other words, an error of 3 1/2 thousandths of an inch will stifle the notes on the adjoining strings. Always remember that vibrating strings make the space for fingers much, much smaller. Well-trained hands do not have to rely on the eyes to guide them. Most of these studies are based on utilizing the natural tones of the major and minor scales. All scales are important, very important, particularly the diatonic scales, because the spacing of the tones describe the harmonic, melodic mode of the keys, the mood of the music. The scales are very comforting, assuring. Everything around us changes constantly. The scales do not change. Only the use of them changes. And of course, at the head of the list of important scales is the chromatic scale from which all scales are born. The chromatic scale is the mother of all scales. Many people believe the scales to just be a painful formality that must be endured for a short time. It disturbs me whenever I hear budding young students complain about the nuisance of having to bother with scales, because little do they realize that all music, whether it be jazz, classical, or any idiom in between, demands complete working knowledge of them. It is absolutely essential that scales become firmly embedded in the mind and physically playable. The player must be prepared to cope with the unknown, especially the professional, but he or she cannot cover all of the unknowns. They can prepare themselves by becoming familiar with key mechanisms and notations that will enable them to handle unfamiliar situations, mechanisms that require just slight modifications and adjustments. Example, if the player is familiar with the diatonic and chromatic scales, any scales can be played. Webster's dictionary describes the meaning of the term progression in these words: the movement of musical parts in harmony, also a succession of musical tones. Moving one or two notes, just one half tone, almost always changes the musical meaning and direction of a progression quite a bit. Every step in a progression, long or short, is a musical switch track, so to speak, that can send the voices in many different directions. Experimenting with and taking advantage of all the opportunities and possibilities of these switch tracks provide is, I believe, the best teacher. I'm not a musicologist as such, but as far as I know, there are no set formulas or rules for progression, just as there are no set formulas or rules for taste. Voices can go any direction at any time. The harmony can ascend, descend, move sideways, zigzag, etc. Most of the time, progressions are a mixture of all the aforementioned, and the musically artistic result depends on the composer's sense of balance, proportion, and taste. Progressions come in all sizes. They can be smooth and flowing, while others can be quite disjointed and still sound pleasing to the ear. The only real test for music is time. Does it wear well? Does a person want to hear it again and again, or is once enough? I don't mean to infer that progressions are things set apart from the music itself. Progression is the very heart of music, and that is why short and semi-long progressions must be worked with and studied carefully in order to be able to understand the complete freedom voices can enjoy. Progression is a wonderfully exciting, independent form that does not have to belong to any one key or mode. I like to think of the term progression as a huge, constantly flowing river of ever-changing musical tones that can be tapped into from all angles and attitudes, upstream, downstream, midstream, bottom, top, etc.